Chapter 4 of Winning His Way by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, in which Frank Morris and Dan Harwwod start the ball rolling. "Well, Dan," said Frank Morris to his friend Dan Harwwod when the two boys met by appointment after supper that evening at the office of the Argus, "are you with me?" "Am I with you? Well, say, you can bank on it as I am," said Dan with his freckled countenance expanding into one of his usual cheerful grins. "Did you resign from the Times?" "That's what I did. And you can bet your suspenders old Bentley was mad as a hatter. He called me several things I wouldn't dare repeat." "You're not under any obligations to him, are you?" asked Frank anxiously. "I should say not. I never could do enough for him while in his employ. I wasn't his foreman, thank goodness. Poor old Jinx has a hard time of it. I gave him a lift whenever I could at the stone and make-up. You know I'm pretty rapid at that. I said half of the advertisements and most of the job work. However, I didn't leave Bentley with a hole at all, for he hired your late foreman Billings, who dropped in looking for work after I resigned." "Well, I'm glad to hear he's got a person in your place," said Frank with an air of relief. "I wouldn't like him to feel that I had put him at a disadvantage by taking you away." "Don't worry about that. Billings ought to be able to fill the bill. He didn't do it here, but probably that's because Mr. Jebb let him do as he pleased. Well, Dan, I'll expect you to put your shoulder to the wheel. That's what I'm here for, Frank. I guess you know whether or not you can depend on me. I learned the business under your father, and he, I think, admitted that I panned out all right." "Yes, Dan. Father always said you were the smartest printer for your age he ever saw, and my father was one of the best at the business himself years ago before he went into the publishing line. And you certainly have a wonderful knack at making interesting locals and spicy paragraphs." "Kind of comes natural to me," said Dan with another grin. "Well, let's get down to business, Dan. I'm sorry to say the Argus is in a pretty bad way." Harwwod showed no surprise at this information, for Frank had consulted with him before on this subject when he talked with him about Mr. Jebb's methods and the loss of prestige and income the paper was suffering under that gentleman's peculiar management. Now Frank told him of the conversation he had overheard that afternoon between Mr. Jebb and Squire Roach, which only went to confirm the suspicions the two boys had already formed in their own minds days before. "That man Jebb is a rascal," said Dan vigorously, "and it would give me great pleasure to knock him into the middle of next week. When he discharged me, I demanded his reason, but he refused to give me any satisfaction. Then I told you about it, and you promised to have the matter investigated. But of course your father's condition interfered with that. So when I saw a chance to go to work on the Times, I accepted it until things got straightened out at the Argus. It remains for you and I, Dan, to straighten things out." "Well, we'll do it all right. So far as you are concerned, it will be plain sailing, with some extra hard work at the start. But I'm up against it hard, Dan. I have no real editorial experience, though I'm fairly familiar in a general way with the newspaper methods, owing to the many opportunities I had to put in my spare time under Father's direction, both at the business desk and in reporting such events as came within my scope. So you see, I'm greatly handicapped." "Pooh, you'll manage all right. You're a good writer. Many a story of yours I've set up myself, Frank, and I'm bound to say you handle the subjects all right. What I lack in experience I'm going to make up by hard work and plenty of it. The paper is going downhill. We've got to put the brakes on, turn her around, and pull her up again where she was before Father took sick." "All right, Frank. How does the Argus stand for tomorrow?" "Well, there are a lot of proofs here that haven't been read yet. I guess most of the copy is in type. Whatever we lack we'll have to make up with plate matter. There seems to be several boxes of it on hand that haven't been used. Our advertisements look kind of skimpy this week, I'm sorry to say. That's where it hits us on a tender spot. Newspapers can't be run on wind." "Hardly. The Times has got most of the business you've lost. It's up to you now to get it back again. Well, Dan, light up in the composing room and take a look around and see what's to be done, while I read some of these proofs for you to correct. It looks as though we had a night's work before us." Dan did as directed, while Frank, pencil in hand, tackled the pile of proofs Mr. Robinson should have attended 2 hours before. Green River supported 3 newspapers, the Times, Democratic organ, and the Argus, Republican ditto, both issued twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays. The Record was an independent weekly, devoted largely to farming interests, but was inferior in circulation and influence to the other two. Politically, the town was pretty evenly divided, though if anything the Democrats had of late the better of the situation. At any rate, this party had won out the last local election, and was in control of the leading offices, and consequently the Times enjoyed a monopoly of the public printing. Mr. Morris had always vigorously supported the Republican cause, and when that party was in power had participated in the fruits of its success. When Mr. Jebb took charge of the Argus about the first of the year, it was expected he would carry out the policy of the paper in the same strict lines. The Republican managers who had just lost the election, although Farmer Gray, who, through the influence of Mr. Morris, had obtained a nomination to the state legislature over Squire Roach, had been elected by a small plurality, were not at all pleased to observe the lukewarm sentiments of the new editor. A committee was appointed to call on Mr. Morris at his home and remonstrate. Mr. Morris lost no time in calling Mr. Jebb down, and for a time the political tone of the Argus was restored, but this improvement lasted only as long as it seemed advisable to Mr. Jebb to continue it. A second committee was unable to see Mr. Morris on account of the state of his health, and the members transferred their attention to Mr. Jebb personally, but met with such little consideration that they retired in disgust. In consequence, many of the Republicans withdrew their support from the Argus, several of the biggest advertisers going so far as to take their business announcements to the Times, while a few handed them to the Record. A great many subscriptions were temporarily canceled for the purpose of bringing the editor of the Argus to terms, but this produced no results, as Mr. Jebb was acting under instructions from Squire Roach, who at the same time was one of the most rabid of the Republican kickers, and was doing his best to lay the whole blame for the backsliding of the Argus to the sick proprietor, who was unaware of the tempest that was brewing through the treachery of the man he had hired to fill his place. Frank Morris had thought proper to interview the chairman of the Republican organization and assure him of his father's loyalty to the party, and his belief that Mr. Jebb was acting entirely on his own responsibility. The boy said that as soon as his father got better, the trouble would be corrected. But Mr. Morris didn't get better. On the contrary, he got worse, and finally died, much to Squire Roach's satisfaction, who now thought he saw his way clear to getting possession of the Argus from the widow. Such was the condition of things in respect to the Argus when Frank took charge, and one of his first acts was to kill an editorial of Mr. Jebb's on the Republican outlook for 1905, and rewrite it along the vigorous and outspoken lines formerly pursued by his father. There was nothing lukewarm about the leader when he had finished it. It was sharp, concise, and to the point. "I want you to put this to type right away, Dan," he said, walking into the composing room. "Double-let it and put it at the head of the second column on the editorial page." "All right," said Dan, taking up a stick and going to a frame holding a pair of 10-point cases. Previous to this, Dan had corrected a dozen proofs, made up 2 pages of the paper, completed a third which Billings had left unfinished, and had commenced to set up out of his head half a column of local paragraphs, most of which he had collected from the Times that day, when Frank called him off to set up the editorial. The young editor then prepared an article in which he stated the policy of the paper would hereafter be aggressively Republican, as in the days when his father was at the helm, and he appealed directly to the voters of the party to support his efforts in the way he hoped to deserve of them. He carried the copy to Dan with instructions to double-let it also, and insert it directly under the publication announcements in the first column of the editorial page. The 2 boys finished their labors shortly after 3 on Saturday morning, and when the pressman turned up at 4 o'clock he found the pair of chases, each containing 2 of the outside pages, the inside 4 having been worked off Friday afternoon, ready to go to press. End of Chapter 4.